Hello, and welcome to all of you joining us from across the world. On behalf of the REPI Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies at the Mario Einaudi Center for International Studies, I welcome you to this panel discussion. My name is Peter Katzenstein. I hold the Carpenter Professorship of International Studies at Cornell, and I'm the acting interim director for the REPI Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies, while Professor Rebecca Slayton is taking a well-deserved sabbatical leave. We are joined today by an excellent panel of experts who will discuss the future of nuclear security policy against the backdrop of Russia's war in Ukraine. As this war has evolved, it has brought back memories of the Cold War. The threats posed by nuclear technology have become all too real and plausible. We find ourselves in a moment when the reckless Russian occupation of Europe's largest nuclear power plant puts it just one arbitrary strike away from turning into Chernobyl. Experts on this panel will help us make sense of this moment in time. We are joined by Tom Collina. Tom is Director of Policy at Plowshares Fund with 30 years of Washington, D.C. experience in nuclear weapons, missile defense, and non-proliferation issues. Tom is a co-author with former Secretary of Defense William Perry of the book called The Button: The New Nuclear Arms Race and Presidential Power from Truman to Trump, published in 2020. Tom also co-hosts the Plowshares Fund podcast, Press the Button. He has testified before the Senate Armed Services and Foreign Relations Committees and has been published in the New York Times and the Washington Post, among others. Tom has a degree in international relations from Cornell University. Welcome home, Tom.
Thank you.
Dr. Fiona Cunningham is Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. She's also faculty fellow at the Perry World House and affiliated with the Center for the Study of Contemporary China and the Christopher Brown Center for International Politics at the University of Pennsylvania. Her research interests lie at the intersection of technology and conflict, with an empirical focus on China. Fiona's current book project explains how and why China threatens to use space weapons, cyber attacks, and conventional missiles as substitutes for nuclear threats in limited wars. Her research has been published in International Security Studies, the Texas National Security Review, and the Washington Quarterly. Her work has also been featured in the New York Times and The Economist. Dr. Mariana Bujanin is a senior research associate with the project on managing the atom at the Harvard's Kennedy School Belfer Center. Formerly, she held appointments as a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow at MTA, a fellow at Harvard's Davis Center for Russian Eurasian Studies, and as a visiting professor at Tufts University, as well as the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt, Germany. Mariana's research focuses on international non-proliferation, arms control, nuclear crises, and post-Soviet nuclear history. Mariana's book, Inheriting the Bomb: The Collapse of the USSR and the Nuclear Disarmament of Ukraine, is forthcoming in December 2022 with Johns Hopkins University Press. Dr. Pavel Padrick is a senior researcher in the WMD program at the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research. Pavel started his work at the Center for Arms Control Studies at the Moscow Institute of Physics and Technology. He's also a researcher with the Program of Science and Global Security at Princeton University and a member of the International Panel on Fissile Materials. Pavel's areas of expertise include nuclear disarmament, arms control, fissile materials, verification, and nuclear security. His current research focuses on the Russian strategic forces and nuclear weapons complex, as well as technical and political aspects of nuclear non-proliferation, disarmament, missile defense, and US-Russian arms control processes. He runs his own research project on Russian nuclear forces. Thank you for joining this panel discussion and for lending us your time and your expertise. Before I hand it over to Tom Collina, who has graciously accepted the task of moderating this panel, I would like to thank our co-sponsors, the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs and the Institute for European Studies at Cornell University. This panel discussion is part of Einaudi Center's Democratic Threats and Resilience Research Priority. Tom?
Professor Katzenstein, thank you so much for that warm welcome. And it's an honor to be here with my esteemed colleagues. And as always, a privilege to be back at Cornell, even in a virtual way. So it's a pleasure to be here. As Professor Katzenstein said, today we're talking about Russia's recent continuing brutal invasion of Ukraine and how it raises many concerns about how Russia is using nuclear threats and what impact this crisis might have on the future of arms control and non-proliferation. You know, I'm amazed that people are worried about nuclear war in a way that they haven't been for decades. And that makes this a moment, an important time for us to have a rich and critical discussion about these important issues. And we couldn't have more distinguished experts to help us have this conversation today. And you just heard about their fabulous qualifications for being here. So let's get into it. I'd like to start off by asking each of you how Russia's war in Ukraine has changed or shifted your work in the past 6 months, and how it has affected the goals for your work ahead, and what new questions you might be trying to answer. And we'll start with Mariana.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation to this panel. It is truly an honor to be part of this today, and especially at such a, as Tom, you impressed upon all of us, how critical and how important this moment of history is. You know, I am from Ukraine originally. My family is still there. My friends is there. It is still home. So of course, the war impacted not only my research, but very much on a personal way. I live this war even through this distance, even at this distance, being in the United States. So it has inundated every free minute of my time, where I follow what's going on and the developments there. But of course, it just so happens that I have started the research on the history of Ukraine's nuclear disarmament in the early 1990s, when I was a PhD student at Central European University. And at that time, you know, I was asked by many, by many on my dissertation committee and by many in the faculty, why is this important? Why is this moment in nuclear history? It kind of happened quickly and was sort of forgotten quickly. Why do we need to know more about it? And of course, after 2014, people stopped asking that, and under very unfortunate circumstances, it seems that the history of what had happened in the immediate aftermath of the Soviet collapse with nuclear weapons in that space has gained a new urgency and a new meaning. So to answer your question, I have a book coming up on the history of Ukrainian nuclear disarmament. I am hoping that with this book, there might be a greater and more nuanced understanding of what exactly has happened, what Ukraine did give up and what it didn't give up, what was promised to Ukraine and why, and what was breached and what wasn't. And I'm hoping that this kind of evidence-based this evidence and this evidence-based account could contribute to a more nuanced and a better informed debate about the value of nuclear weapons and about the value of security assurances, right, as a way to stop nuclear non-proliferation. Another thing that I've been, and I will finish with that I've been following closely is the kind of the state of global nuclear governance, meaning the state of governance of civilian nuclear energy, and how well or not it is equipped at this moment to deal with an unprecedented occurrence, with an unprecedented set of events surrounding the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant that is currently occupied by the Russian military, is being shelled. There are serious security and safety breaches at the plant. So this has been my world for the last 6 months or so.
Mariana, thank you very much for that. And Fiona, if we could hear from you next about how Ukraine and the crisis there has changed your work.
Okay, so thank you very much, Tom. And I'd also just like to add my thanks to Mariana's to Cornell for convening this fantastic panel, and to Professor Katzenstein for the very warm welcome. So having perhaps listened a little bit to the introduction about my work, you may be wondering, why is somebody who appears to be so focused on East Asia and China, who comes with an Australian accent, is speaking on a panel to do with Ukraine? And I think that highlights perhaps the fact that this conflict has impacts that reach beyond Ukraine, that reach beyond Europe, that reach beyond the transatlantic relationship to really shape world affairs, including those in the Indo-Pacific. So a lot of my work has focused on states, and especially China's strategy for deterring and fighting future wars, and their approaches to strategic deterrence. And for the past sort of 20 years or so, I would say that most of those strategies have been relatively theoretical. But there is a common saying that no plan survives first contact with the enemy. So the way in which Russia's war in Ukraine has really affected my research is that it offers other states, especially China, an opportunity to observe whether some of the assumptions that they have been making about how future wars are going to be fought, whether they are accurate, and indeed to think a little bit about the implications of what they observe in Ukraine might be for their own war plans, for their own war preparations, for their own approach to strategic deterrence, including their ability to deter the outbreak of conflict in the first place with a suite of capabilities, including but not only their nuclear weapons. So I have been particularly interested in watching the Ukraine conflict unfold, how Russia's strategic deterrence concepts have actually operated in practice compared to what I understand them to be in theory in this conflict, and especially with regards to deterring NATO intervention. I've also been very interested in where escalation risks have popped up in the course of this conflict, and how they've been managed by Russia, NATO, the US, and the Ukraine, and including some of the expected escalation risks that appear to have been sort of dogs that haven't barked in certain technological domains. So overall, you might say that I'm interested in how China evaluates its own existing approach and other options for gaining leverage in local wars. I won't go into too much detail because I think we may talk about these in more detail throughout the course of the panel discussion. But I do just want to note that, of course, I have been quite seized by the Ukraine conflict up until about August, when many of you may have also noticed that the PLA, the Chinese People's Liberation Army, has also been quite busy in the Taiwan Straits conducting unprecedented military exercises to protest the visit of US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi to the island. And so since August, I do have to say my attention has been turned away from Ukraine to watching the way in which those events have unfolded as well. So perhaps a signal of just how much is going on in the realm of international security these days. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Fiona. And yes, we will be coming back to the China aspect of all this soon. And last but not least, Pavel, please tell us how Ukraine crisis has affected your work.
Well, it certainly affected the work in many ways. It was also a very personal, still is, because as it happens, I had family on literally every single side of this conflict, including Moscow, Lugansk, and Kiev, and neutral Switzerland. So it's been a very difficult experience on many levels, and of course it was echoing what Fiona said. There were a number of things that we kind of used to think about theoretically became practical. Sort of, you all of a sudden the little that I know about the Soviet-Russian nuclear operations and procedures became a very practical issue. Is Russian president capable of launching nuclear weapons? And what is the chance of use of tactical weapons and things like that? So, and I must admit, it took some time to kind of process the questions and to come up with some better knowledge of the situation and kind of shape it into a better understanding. So it's not just kind of academia anymore in many ways. And also, speaking of work, I was hoping that I will be happily working on nuclear disarmament verification for some time, and it turns out, in fact, that that's not dead. And in many ways, one is that that work helped understand better again, how the Russian nuclear forces operate. And also, this crisis helped sort of recalibrate and in many ways validate some of the ideas that we've been working on, namely that nuclear weapons should be as far away from anything as possible. And so that's, it's very unfortunate that this kind of a, you have to have your proof by this kind of a brutal way, but at the same time, it's, I hope that kind of our work could provide some answers and some way to maybe avert future crisis of this sort. Let me stop here. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And I do want to thank you all for reminding us that this is not just a professional issue, right? For many of us, this is a personal issue in many ways, and that makes it all the harder and all the more important. I'm going to ask a series of questions to our panelists. Those of you in the audience, you can submit questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get to those after this first round of questions from me. So starting with Mariana, stepping back to the beginning of this conflict, many were asking, you know, if Ukraine had, and you've had this question many times before, if Ukraine had kept its nuclear weapons at the end of the Cold War, would Russia have invaded? And because you've been asked this question so many times before, I would like to flip it on its head and say, you know, would Russia have invaded Ukraine if Russia did not have nuclear weapons? And if you would take it that way, please. Thank you very much.
Well, absolutely. That's I think a more instructive counterfactual. Just to say a few words to the first counterfactual, had Ukraine kept the nuclear weapons, would it have been invaded? The quick, I think the intuitive way, the theoretical, let's say, way to say, well, would be to say, if deterrence works for, you know, France, if deterrence works for the United States, if deterrence works for Russia, why wouldn't it have worked for Ukraine? So if we strip the complexity and if we strip the actual kind of historical facts of what Ukraine inherited, what it would have needed to do in order to gain or develop a fully functional nuclear deterrent, I think that's where many observers are gravitating toward. The problem, of course, is that, or the reality is a lot more complex. What Ukraine had inherited from the Soviet Union was a nuclear option, was not a ready-to-use nuclear deterrent. It would have needed to still invest quite heavily and defy international opprobrium in order to fashion a usable quote unquote deterrent out of whatever weapons technology, military industrial capacity that it had inherited, which was not negligible. So technologically, of course, it was doable, right? If North Korea and Pakistan could develop nuclear weapons, certainly Ukraine could have, should have had the motivation, the desire, and the standing power to withstand international opprobrium, probably sanctions and so forth. It is certainly fair to say that Ukraine would have been a different country today as a result of those actions. So we can't just take that one variable, nuclear weapons or no nuclear weapons, remove it or add it back in and hope that everything else will be staying constant. It would not. But it certainly seems, going to the other counterfactual, it does seem that judging from this very early use of nuclear threats, very early in the conflict by the Russian side, we see more than anything, I think, to me as a scholar and a sort of a person who navigates these spaces, it shows just the extent of reliance of the Russian state at this point on that kind of nuclear deterrent in prosecuting a war in Ukraine. Many of those threats that we heard emanating from Kremlin were really quite superfluous. Everyone knows Russia is, a major nuclear power. Everybody knows that it's locked into a relationship of deterrence with the United States and NATO. There's really no way, no extra need to impress that upon everybody. And my hunch is that NATO and U.S. involvement would have stayed very much the same like it is now, even if those threats were not vocalized so ubiquitously by the Russian leadership. But the fact that the fact of this reliance on the nuclear threats tells me that that element was quite important, quite essential to the Russian leadership's calculation of whether to invade or not. So it was almost an enabling factor, right? To use a nuclear threat to ensure NATO's and US non-involvement while you prosecute this kind of regional war, conventional war in Ukraine.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. Just a quick follow-up. You said that there would have been a difference had Russia not had nuclear weapons, but it sounds like you don't think there would have been much difference in what has happened since the invasion had Russia not made the threats. Is that right?
That's true. Yeah. So Russian, threats are quite, obvious. I mean, the information that they're trying to relate, I suppose they're trying to also relate kind of the resolve, right? To communicate the resolve that perhaps we're serious about this and we would, carry out a threats should you cross our red lines. But we know from the history of the Cold War that the two nuclear-armed superpowers really did make every effort to avoid direct military confrontation, direct military clashes. There were many proxy wars and other things, but the deterrence did work in that way, it seems, to restrain and to induce restraint between the two nuclear superpowers, to be very cautious in avoiding these direct clashes. So it is my impression that this would have very likely continued into the present day conflict. And certainly Western leaders, including President Biden, have made it abundantly clear that the West will not get involved directly, will not deploy any forces on the Ukrainian side, even before the invasion.
Thank you very much. Fiona, turning to you, the Ukraine conflict has apparently become an opportunity for Russia to implement some non-nuclear defense concepts that it's been investing in and maybe hoping to exercise, such as long-range precision strike. So give us your sense of why Putin issued the nuclear threats, rather than just rely on what also everyone knew was his quite formidable conventional capability.
Thank you very much for the question, Tom. And I think this actually does dovetail on very nicely from Mariana's comments just now. So I would say I think this is a question I have some difficulty answering, but that I definitely want to pose as a non-Russia expert. Kind of drawing from the research of experts on Russian nuclear strategy, some of whom are very much on this call and should absolutely, I'm looking forward to hearing their views as well. There is something of a gap in the theory and practice of Russian strategic deterrence and what I think we saw in the lead up to and since in Ukraine. So Russia was in some ways signaling to NATO with its most destructive capabilities when it spent 2 decades building up capabilities that it thought would be more credible, its non-nuclear capabilities to threaten to use in wars that don't implicate the survival of the Russian state. So to kind of explain the theory a little bit insofar as I understand it, and I'm simplifying wildly here, but by Russian strategy pronouncements, nuclear weapons are designed to ensure the existence of the state, whether from nuclear or conventional existential threats. And the existence of the Russian state could be threatened in what I understand to be a regional war, which could be a conventional war with NATO in Europe. But the employment of Russian nuclear weapons do not have a role to play in Russian nuclear doctrine to achieve political aims in local wars, meaning the kinds of conflicts that Russia is currently fighting in Ukraine. And in addition to this aspect of its nuclear strategy, Russia's also developed information confrontation concepts that would look at using cyber and information operations before a conflict broke out to shape the environment, as well as non-nuclear strategic deterrence, in particular through the development of conventional precision strike capabilities, but also counter-space capabilities that would give it other options before it might choose to turn to non-strategic nuclear weapons. So Russia essentially had these other lower rungs to its escalation ladder before it chooses to turn to nuclear weapons use. And again, that would be in the use of its capabilities rather than in the threats that it's issued. But I'm still curious to know why Russia skipped over the lower rungs of its escalation ladder when it was issuing threats to NATO to really emphasize its strategic nuclear weapons. And I think there are kind of 4 possibilities that I'll put out on the table. The first is that Russia signaled with its strategic nuclear weapons and not the non-strategic ones it would be most likely to use in a Ukraine conflict as a way of managing escalation risks. So the idea here was really to attempt to signal to NATO, remind NATO of what the worst case scenario might be, rather than to directly threaten to be starting a limited nuclear war. And we might think of signaling with some of Russia's precision conventional missiles in Europe might also have been perceived as a direct threat by Europe to actually use those capabilities rather than to sort of signal how bad the conflict could become. So there's an escalation management aspect to this. The second possibility is that Russia might have looked at some of its non-nuclear capabilities and found that they're actually harder to use than its doctrine might suggest for signaling against NATO for reasons of both this escalation risk as well as observability. So Russia might have seen drawing attention to its counter-space attacks, for example, as being too escalatory, or drawing attention to its offensive cyber capabilities as perhaps not escalatory enough because of the kinds of effects that they could have. And as scholars have pointed out, it's quite difficult to make specific and credible deterrent threats to conduct cyber attacks that might have strategic effects because those capabilities are unobservable and may be lost if they're actually revealed against a specific target. A third possibility is that space and cyber capabilities, which are part of Russia's concepts, could be used to signal privately, such that only the perpetrator and the victim or the intended victim might know that signaling is taking place. And to give an example of this, if a Russian satellite were to pass too close to a French or a US surveillance satellite, these are things that maybe the United States or France might know, but we may not necessarily know sitting outside of those government documents. So things may have occurred in the conflict that we don't know about, or in the sort of lead up to it, unless they're disclosed by the actors involved. I do want to point out, though, that in June, US Cyber Command Commander Paul Nakasone acknowledged that the US had engaged in offensive, defensive, and information operations in cyberspace against Russia. So this is, of course, not to say that Russia has held back on using its missiles, using its cyber capabilities, and even some tactical counter-space attacks against Ukraine as opposed to NATO. But it's likely held and reserved some of its most sophisticated and destructive capabilities for use in case the conflict escalates into a regional war with NATO. And finally, I just point out that I think its missiles and cyber operations that were conducted against NATO don't seem to have lived up to some of the expectations of their potential effects. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks. If I could just give you a follow-up, because I'm sure our audience would probably want to know, under what conditions do you think Russia might use nuclear weapons in this conflict?
So I think the most likely contingency, this is the $1 billion question, not even the $1 million question. I think the most likely is if the conflict were to be on the cusp of, or to escalate to involve direct NATO military involvement, where to Russia, it looked like the conflict was going to become a regional war involving NATO, where NATO's conventional forces could pose a threat to the existence of the Russian state. I consider that to be the most likely possibility, but I do know that others have considered some other possibilities of when Russia might use those weapons. In particular, are concerned about the Russian regime seeing a threat to its grip on power. I would defer to Russia experts on how the relationship between regime security and nuclear weapons, but just would note that, for example, in China, that relationship between regime threats and the use of nuclear weapons is not a direct line, and it's not one that's drawn in any strategy document. So I think we need to be careful about equating the use of nuclear weapons with all types of existential threats.
Thank you very much. Pavel, turning to you, the war in Ukraine has not been kind to arms control or non-proliferation so far. U.S.-Russian talks to scope out a follow-on treaty to the New START treaty that expires in a few years have been paused. We saw just last week the non-proliferation treaty review conference end in disarray. So give us your sense of the arms control impacts here. For example, do you expect other countries to seek nuclear weapons to protect themselves from the threats that Ukraine is facing? And what do you see as the prospects for New START, a replacement for New START?
Well, let me start with the first question. I think actually, of course, especially in the nuclear community and nuclear expert community and non-proliferation, this is like everybody says, oh, look, this is the proof that you need nuclear weapons to deter, to prevent this kind of thing. But I'm actually not sure that that's the lesson that we could take out of this this war. Imagine, and back to Mariana, you of course is right that Ukraine would have been a different country had it tried to keep nuclear weapons and all that. But imagine that today, Ukraine as it is now, all of a sudden has its own nuclear weapons. What would it do? What would President Zelensky do to, I don't know, to stop the war? To do what? To bomb Moscow? If you start kind of thinking about this in these terms, you actually realize that, well, the set of options is not particularly great. And I would argue, in fact, we could dispute the current war. But for example, if Ukraine had nuclear weapons in 2014 during the annexation of Crimea, I'm sure that there was no chance it would have used those weapons, and those weapons would have not prevented the annexation. That's just I mean, we could say, well, what would be the calculation in Moscow? That's slightly different. But if Russia would have tried that, it would have gotten away. I'm definitely. Or today, Russia could do something along this kind of a little green man operation in, I don't know, in Estonia. And it is far from clear that NATO would be willing to kind of escalate to rely on its nuclear weapons to do anything with that. So, and yes, you could say that for Russia, of course, Russia sort of used its nuclear weapons and tried to hide behind nuclear weapons to launch this war. And that's true. But then you kind of start thinking, did it get any kind of a mileage out of it? And I think the answer is no. Did it get any military success? No. By any, I guess, by any objective measure, Russia is worse off today than it was on the February 23rd. And if you go to December 2013, it's even worse than that. So in a sense, what nuclear weapons did to Russia, it just kind of brought it into this catastrophic adventure with no gain whatsoever. So that's do you really want the weapons? They do something like that to your own country? Probably not. If you look at NATO, again, all the weapons that NATO has, they didn't do anything to prevent this. Well, we can argue that this is Ukraine is not in NATO, but I had quite a few conversations with people from Poland, from Estonia, from other states. They were not feeling particularly secure, and they still don't. And if you look at where the NATO policy is going, I mean, all this kind of conventional buildup and all that, you can see that NATO doesn't feel particularly protected by its nuclear weapons vis-a-vis Russia. So that is another kind of lesson from this, if you want to. And also, I think this is something that we all felt quite viscerally, I would say. What you get when you get nuclear weapons is basically this non-zero probability of a truly catastrophic confrontation. So I think if you kind of start weighing all this together, I think the conclusion may not be in favor of nuclear weapons. And I would argue that it should not be, and I would argue that this is the kind of a message that we should take out of this war. Very quickly on arms control, in a way, I don't think that it is dead, in a sense that there were signals from both sides that the United States and Russia, they want to do something. And the reason is that there is a value in having some kind of a channel of communication and all that. But it's also important to understand that, and again, we've seen that very clearly, that in fact, the arms control is a strange kind of animal in the sense that we can see that numbers don't really matter. It doesn't matter if Russia had, I don't know, 1,500 or 2,500 weapons, or just had 100 or 10. The danger would have been there pretty much the same. So I think it's not the number of weapons that matters. It's the fact that they are there that matters. And the fact that they are shaping the policy, the policies, the narratives. And I think that that's, in a way, again, we should hope that arms control will continue in a sense that it would bring us somewhere closer to this understanding that we should do something about nuclear weapons as a phenomenon, if you will, not as physical objects that are need to be eliminated. Thank you.
Thank you. And just to follow up, I mean, the New START treaty expires 2026, I believe. Is it your sense that there's time, given that probably politically they'll not be able to start talks, presumably while the Ukraine war is so hot? Do you think there'll be time to wind down the conflict and then have fruitful discussions to replace New START?
Well, I think speaking practically, there was no time even before the war started. So if you do the math, it would have been very difficult. So I'm fairly skeptical that there will be a new agreement of the kind. However, there is a silver lining there. Maybe there is a simple option in a way, is to sign the same New START with a different number, or even the New START with the same number. So I think that's the kind of a break the glass kind of option that is there. And in fact, again, I think it has some advantages. It has some problems, of course, but it's doable. So we don't know. We'll see.
Thank you. Fiona, turning to you. Turning back to you. Let's step back a little bit here and think about what it means that we're entering this time of great power competition. And the world is still armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons. We never quite got rid of them at the end of the Cold War. And I think we're being reminded of that now, that like, oh boy, these weapons are still around. So what does it mean to you? And what are the risks of continuing to maintain large nuclear arsenals as great power competition heats up?
So I think Pavel has really laid the groundwork for what I want to say on this question, which is that I think the risks and benefits of large nuclear arsenals, to me, are actually less important than other aspects of how nuclear weapons are used or are harnessed, if you like, in this great power competition. So I think the first, I'll point to sort of three things that I think are more important than the sheer numbers. The first is how they're postured. And by that, I mean, what kinds of declaratory policies great powers are adopting? Are they threatening to use nuclear weapons first? For what purposes? And we do see, I think, in the course of heating up great power competition, even some adjustments in how the US's declaratory policies looked under the Trump administration. And I think many of us are waiting and have been waiting for some time to see what the Biden administration's nuclear posture review is going to do in terms of declaratory policy, whether it is going to maintain some of the more forward-leaning uses of nuclear weapons contemplated in the 2018 US nuclear posture review, or roll some of them back. In addition to that, other aspects of posture that matter are whether a state's nuclear weapons are geared towards limited nuclear strikes to try and influence a conventional conflict. We see this definitely with Russia. Are they accurate and kept on a high alert status so that they can threaten another state's ability to retaliate for nuclear strikes? So to me, all of these aspects of posture are perhaps more important than the size of a state's nuclear arsenal. A small, vulnerable nuclear arsenal that's geared towards asymmetric escalation of a conventional conflict like Pakistan's actually, to me, is more dangerous than a big one that has lots of redundancy and that's geared towards retaliation. The second thing that I want to point to is that the kind of risks and benefits of maintaining large arsenals in this era of great power competition aren't actually going to be uniform across the kind of key arenas of great power competition in the Indo-Pacific and in Europe. The risks of relying on nuclear weapons, I think, are going to depend on the scope and intensity of the conflicts that states are expecting to fight, how they think about existential threats, and how they think about the role of nuclear weapons in countering them. So on this point, I really want to emphasize that I think that China and Russia actually have quite different perceptions of existential threats and the role of nuclear weapons in defending them. They have quite different nuclear postures. China has a much smaller nuclear arsenal, kept still, I think, largely on lower alert status, and with a more defensive declaratory policy than Russia. And both of those two countries are conceptualizing different kinds of conflicts with the United States, despite the fact, I think that often in the US, we have a tendency to treat China and Russia as similar kinds of threats, including in the nuclear space, that require similar kinds of solutions. So my research has suggested that the PRC relies much more on information age weapons as substitutes for nuclear use. So that is its offensive cyber capabilities that could attack strategic targets, its counter space capabilities, and its arsenal of conventional missiles. While Russia, I believe, is much more reliant on its nuclear arsenal for coercive leverage than China is. And I think an important reason for this difference between the two countries is geographical differences in the Indo-Pacific and Europe, such that a conventional war on the European continent is viewed as an existential threat for Russia, but China does not perceive a similar threat from a conventional war with the United States in the Indo-Pacific as something that could actually threaten the survival of the state. The final, I think, issue that the great power competition raises for the risks of maintaining large numbers of nuclear weapons concerns the future of US nuclear strategy, because the US now faces this issue of deterring two great power competitors who have formidable nuclear arsenals, and it has the US, that is, real resource constraints on thinking about its conventional deployments. And I think this raises some really thorny issues about the role of nuclear weapons in great power competition with the two countries. Some of those questions are things like, can the US deter both of these two countries by relying largely on conventional capabilities? And if it does, what does that mean for the US defense budget? What kind of allied assistance and partnerships does the US need to build to ensure that it's not tempted to rely more on nuclear weapons? Another issue is how opponents who are willing to use nuclear weapons can be deterred, what kinds of capabilities are necessary to do so. And finally, how can the United States think about signaling different things to these two great power adversaries who use their nuclear weapons differently, who think about them differently going forward? And I think this has been an ongoing challenge for the US's nuclear posture for, I'd say, the last decade or so, and one that is increasingly pertinent as we face this growing salience of nuclear weapons and a much more competitive international environment.
Thank you very much. Now, Mariana, turning back to you, I want to apologize because I saw that you had a two-finger. You wanted to respond to something presumably that Pavel was saying. Why don't you do that, and then, if you don't mind, and then I'll ask you a question, follow-up question.
Yeah, just very quickly, I wanted to address that first issue that Pavel raised about whether nuclear deterrence would have worked for Ukraine, even if all of the things being equal, and that perhaps the current situation is not such a boost for the effectiveness of deterrence. There certainly is a different way of looking at it, right? What you highlighted, Pavel, is a general problem with deterrence and how to make it credible. And it wouldn't have been just the problem for President Zelensky. The whole idea is not to use nuclear weapons, but to threaten them credibly so that the other guy doesn't use them or is restrained in other ways. And there certainly is some kind of logic to the fact that Ukraine, in the post-Soviet, post-Cold War order, essentially found itself in a security vacuum. It had an enlarged NATO, protected by US extended deterrence on the one side, and revisionist, belligerent Russia on the other. It is no surprise at all that this kind of scale of conventional war should erupt on the Ukrainian territory. I have every sympathy with the Polish feeling of insecurity, and with, of course, with the long-term prospects for Russia, which we'll see how those play out. But as someone who would like to see these weapons gone, I find myself having a much, much harder time to explain to people how something that's happening in Ukraine could have been avoided without a security guarantee or nuclear security guarantee of a major power or your own nuclear arsenal. I think, there's an argument to be made, but it just made my job that much harder. And none of this can, what we see now, can return the lives of 9,000 Ukrainian military casualties, probably at least the same of civilians. It can, the women that were gang raped in Bucha and Irpin, you can wind that back and say, oh, but at least Russia will suffer, long-term, pain for this. So I think, unfortunately, I think some actors in the international system would look at this situation and say, how can we prevent this from happening in the first place? And what is the role of either nuclear guarantee, which I think there will be a much greater demand, even of the existing allies in Asia Pacific, but also in NATO's eastern flank on the U.S. Kind of provision of security as a security supplier, or if that is not possible, like it was not for Ukraine, right? It didn't have prospects of NATO membership and such, that there might be a consideration of nuclear programs down the road.
If I may, I don't disagree with this, but also, I would strongly suggest that we should not get too deep into this kind of a security interests kind of business. There was a great exchange some time ago on the Russian Twitter with many, and someone just actually noted that none of this would have happened if Putin stepped down in 2011. That's not. And that's true. That's if you know Russia, there is nothing about security vacuum or some Russian imperial ambitions or things like that. That is not the explanation. There is a political dynamic in the country that created this outcome, and that's I'm not saying that it's just one person. It's a system. But that person was there and building that system, and with consent of a large part of the population, which may or may not be happy with how it all turned out. So I would say that it's not clear to me that it was all predetermined in any way, and in fact it wasn't. And I'm convinced that had the political development in Russia go the other way or different way, none of this would have happened. And back to the security guarantees and all that, I think I would argue that in fact I would blame nuclear weapons for that, actually, because what happened to some extent, to a large extent, I would say, is that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, after all this happened, the Europeans kind of decided that, look, we shouldn't worry about things, because the only thing we should get under the umbrella, and things that's security. And who kind of got there were kind of happy, and who didn't were in more difficult situation. But the price for that was that nobody was seriously concerned about the larger security architecture in Europe. That would have, in fact, provided some kind of a checks against this kind of a belligerent this kind of political development in Russia. And that's, again, this is your nuclear weapons. Having more nuclear weapons would not give you more security. And in fact, I'm on record saying that in this situation, the best strategy for NATO is, in fact, to straight away denuclearize this conflict and say we will never use nuclear weapons, even if Russia attacks NATO with nuclear weapons, because that's way you denuclearize it, you raise the threshold for use, and that's the only strategy that will work. And that's I'm ready to talk about this if you have time, but that would be my two-finger intervention.
Thank you. In the interest of time, because I do want to get on to some audience questions, I'm going to ask the last question to Mariana and then to Fiona, and then we're going to go to audience questions. And if Mariana, you want to respond to Pavel in your answer, feel free. But what I wanted to ask you, Mariana, is looking at some recent events. For example, the collapse of the NPT review conference just last week. And now the bold and brave visit by the IAEA to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in Ukraine. Give us your sense of how the Ukraine situation is affecting both the non-proliferation regime and nuclear power reactor safety discussion. Thank you.
Well, the nuclear non-proliferation regime has been described way before this war in Ukraine as a system in distress, as a constant system in distress, because we all know that there are some very important tensions that are already built into this regime. It's a discriminatory regime. There's a standoff between the haves and the have-nots. None of this was brought about by the war in Ukraine, but these tensions and others are exacerbated by this conflict. And we have seen this during this recent NPT RevCon and the failure to adopt the final document. What is, again, another thing that is not caused by the Ukrainian war, but is made more severe, more salient, is the rift between the nuclear halves, within the nuclear halves too, between the nuclear weapon states, specifically between the US and Russia, because we know that even the emergence of the NPT, the emergence of the nuclear non-proliferation, and the sustaining of that regime over the decades relied in large part to this nuclear power condominium, right? Their cooperation, at least within the NPT, to keep the regime, to renew it, to prolong it indefinitely, and so forth. So we see kind of that split too, which makes it very difficult to. I don't think the NPT regime will collapse anytime soon, but it certainly has more built-in tensions, or the built-in tensions within it are more salient. About the work of the IAEA, it has really been very impressive. And again, what we see developing in this war and the situation around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is quite unprecedented. And the existing institutions of global nuclear governance, as I would say, it's the IAEA and adjacent institutions, are really not equipped. It's not really part of their mandate to demilitarize, for instance, something like Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. But within that mandate, I think they're doing, and specifically personally, Director General Rafael Grossi is doing an incredible job. The inspection, the inspectors are there right now, amid shelling and in the very precarious security situation. But you're right, it does raise very serious questions about the future of nuclear energy as a way to mitigate climate change, right? How can we prevent this from happening in the future? Nuclear energy is a commitment for decades to come, and which country can really guarantee that something like that will not transpire in their territory in 50, 60 years? So I think there is certainly a need for rethinking and upgrading, the institutions that we have, international institutions that we have, that could help prevent, but also mitigate these kind of situations going forward.
Thank you very much. And Fiona, I wanted to get back with you on if you could talk a little bit about what China might be learning from the war with Ukraine, and if you could talk a little bit about how a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would be different or similar to Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Okay, so that's a tall order. In the interest of audience questions, I will try and do this relatively quickly. But first is just to acknowledge that a lot of ink has been spilled on the potential lessons that China might learn from this conflict. There's some good commentary out there already looking at what the Chinese People's Liberation Army and Chinese experts are looking at. But I do want to note that the PLA studies other people's wars very, very, very carefully, but often the results of those conflict or the results of those studies don't emerge for even some years after the conflicts have concluded. So in some ways, it's too early to tell what the lessons China might draw are. But I want to focus on one big question, which is the future of China's approach to strategic deterrence. And to set the scene for that, I think it's worth going over the differences between China and Russia's strategic deterrence concepts. And it relates a little bit to this question of what a conflict over Taiwan might look like for China as opposed to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So China's nuclear strategy, unlike Russia's, is optimized for retaliating for nuclear attacks rather than for threatening to use them first. So it has quite a different nuclear posture. But like Russia, China also plans to threaten strategic attacks using space, cyber capabilities, and precision strike capabilities for coercive leverage in conventional wars that it would be fighting under the nuclear shadow. But unlike Russia, these capabilities are the core capability of its strategic deterrent. It relies on space, cyber, and accurate missiles to threaten to escalate a conflict instead of threatening nuclear first use to escalate a conflict. And I call this approach strategic substitution. One of the reasons why China has developed this particular set of capabilities is because it has faced a significant conventional inferiority in a Taiwan Straits contingency since the start of the post-Cold War era. And so in many ways, it actually doesn't have the capability to even try to do some of the things that Russia has done in Ukraine, and that is to conduct an amphibious invasion and actually try to seize and hold Taiwanese territory at this particular point in time. So that's one big, I think, important difference in the conventional capabilities to actually go about this conflict. So what are the lessons China might draw from the conflict in Ukraine for its own approach to strategic deterrence going forward? I think for me, the key question here is whether this strategic substitution approach that it has adopted, relying more on the non-nuclear capabilities to threaten escalation, will continue or not. And I think this depends on the lessons that China draws, and I would point to three potential lessons. The first is that the conflict might confirm to China that having a large and capable nuclear arsenal like Russia's can function as a shield that enables conventional offensive operations against a third party and keeps the US from intervening at all. So this is this kind of nuclear shield hypothesis that we've mentioned already throughout the course of the discussion. I don't think China's leaders and PLA planners are going to abandon their existing planning assumptions for a Taiwan contingency that the US would intervene in a Taiwan contingency just because of what they've seen in Ukraine, but it may give them some confidence that at least nuclear threats can shape the way that your adversary chooses to intervene. A second possible lesson is that China might rightly or wrongly read the conflict as revealing serious limits to these non-nuclear information age weapons as tools of strategic deterrence. As I noted earlier in the discussion, because Russia kind of skipped over signaling using some of these capabilities to brandish its nuclear weapons instead, the conflict might contribute to a kind of loss of confidence in China's existing approach to strategic deterrence, relying on the non-nuclear capabilities. They might decide that these information age weapons just don't provide enough leverage and they need a first use nuclear posture instead. But a third possible lesson from the conflict, which some of the other panelists have already, I think, really highlighted, is that a first-use nuclear doctrine and making nuclear threats, having tactical nuclear weapons, don't actually win you wars. Even if they give you a nuclear shield. So China might conclude based on that lesson, the fact that Russia brandished its nuclear weapons, it has a big arsenal, but still it hasn't been able to achieve its aims on the battlefield, that its plentiful but not unlimited resources are going to be best spent on conventional arms, and that maybe it wants to stick with its strategic substitution approach until it achieves its longer-term goals of military modernization. A final footnote, though, is just to emphasize, I think the conflict suggests that seizing territory using military force is enormously costly, and therefore that peaceful or at least non-military means might still offer the most desirable, even if the probability isn't as high as perhaps in the past for China to achieve its long-held ambition of reunification with the island of Taiwan, rather than going about the route that Russia has attempted.
Fiona, thank you very much. Excellent coverage of a very tough question in a very short period of time. Thank you so much. So I'm going to go now to some questions from the audience, and thank you, audience, for your patience here. This one I'll direct first to Pavel. And an audience member asks, would Ukraine have been less likely to be invaded if NATO had been more aggressive in accepting their membership?
Well, it's too many counterfactuals here. I think, in a way, again, as you may have sensed, I'm skeptical about the kind of a security interest explanations of all this. I think most of the blame for this is, of course, on the Russian leadership and the Russian society in general for having that kind of leadership, because that shaped its vision of security in these kind of terms. At the same time, I think there were definitely blunders on the side of NATO. I already mentioned that this whole drive to NATO made people neglect a lot of things. For example, it would have been good to have the CFE treaty, the adapted CFE treaty in force, but at the time when it was possible, the decision was it was more important to insist on Russia's leaving Moldova or Syria. So I think people did make mistakes, or for that matter, was it in Budapest, this declaration that would made that Ukraine and Georgia will be in NATO, and everybody knew full well that this will not happen, and not because of Russia. I mean, why would then make that declaration? I mean, again, I'm not saying that this led to Putin thinking this and that. That's not. But if that is not a kind of a blunder, what it is. So I think again, there were a lot of mistakes made on the way here, and again, as I would repeat again, most of the blame, virtually all the blame, is on the current Russian leadership, and again, to the extent on the largely Russian society. But that doesn't mean that everybody else should be proud of that. Thanks.
Thank you. Another audience question, this one I'll direct to Mariana. The questioner asks, considering that the IAEA is on a mission to reach Zaporizhia and has now arrived, how likely do you think it is that the IAEA will be able to examine the nuclear power plant and actually be able to provide assistance that there or assurance that there should be no nuclear leak?
So that's a great question. It looks like the inspectors are there. They are examining the plant. That was one of the goals of the mission. There's 5 people from what I understand that are staying there for another 3 days. We really don't know. I at least haven't seen enough to be able to assess exactly what the mission was able or was not able to do. My hope is that they can get kind of an opportunity to candidly speak with the Ukrainian operators, with those engineers and staff that are running this plant in these really difficult situations, and to get kind of a candid assessment from those people of the situation without the Ukrainian personnel being intimidated by the Russian military authorities there. But the mission already brought some technical assistance with them. There are people unpacking it right now, and hopefully after this mission, the assessment of it might be able to bring some more now that this kind of process and this corridor has been established. So the hope is for more such missions and a greater IAEA involvement.
Thank you very much. And another audience question that I think is probably going to be controversial, so maybe we'll offer it up to all of you. The questioner asks, what are the pros and cons of stopping military, presumably US military aid to Ukraine, in particular with respect to the prospects for peace and nuclear risk? Who would like to try that one?
So I can attempt my probably predictable kind of reflection on this. The presumption there is that somehow if the Western aid stops flowing in, that the war then could be finished earlier and somehow would open the space for peace negotiations, and perhaps reach some kind of peaceful settlement. I fundamentally disagree with it at this point, right? At this point in the war, any leverage that might be had by international community could only be applied onto Ukraine, right? So any peace agreement with brokered internationally or so forth would be at Ukrainian expense. And I don't think neither the Ukrainian leadership nor the Ukrainian people, frankly, who are the ones suffering from this, would accept that kind of solution at this point. I think there's still kind of a understanding that the military course of actions has not run its full course just yet. Whether there, a greater involvement of Western involvement would have at all helped earlier on is a question. It's a difficult question. I think what could have done, and to build on Pavel's previous comment, is perhaps a greater involvement, in particular, of the United States post 2014, right? For whatever reasons of their own, the Obama administration at the time handed the Ukraine issue to France and Germany for settlement. That was processed, the Normandy so-called process, was able to achieve a ceasefire, but not a peace settlement, right? So it froze the conflict, did not solve the underlying kind of security predicament. And now again, there was no cost on breaching that agreement imposed on the Russian side. And there we have it.
Thank you. Pavel, and then we'll go to Fiona.
Okay, let me try to be brief. I think stopping the aid assistance to Ukraine and support of Ukraine is probably the wrong way to deal with nuclear risks. I'll talk about nuclear risks because that's, of course, there is this whole issue of Ukraine defending its own territory and people. Because we can do this in various ways, and one consideration is that that will not help to address the core issue. The nuclear threats will be there. So if we worry about nuclear risks, I believe that the way to do that is, in fact, in a way, a greater support of Ukraine in sending a message to Russia that this whole operation is wrong and against the law. And more than that, the very clear, consistent, and strong message coming out of every possible venue that even a thought about using nuclear weapons is criminal and inhumane. So this is, and because I believe that this is the only, it's not a perfect way of dealing with nuclear risk, but that's the only one that we have. And in fact, if you look at the statements, the official statements that the Russians were made, they backtracked. They stopped. They went on defensive after the initial kind of a pushback. They said, "Oh no, this is all our doctrine is only it's all defensive and all that." So, and in that sense, I think for example, the TPNW, the Treaty on the Non-Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, had a very strong message. We condemn all and any nuclear threats. And that message is something that that would help to deal with nuclear risks. Stopping aid to Ukraine will not be helpful.
Thank you. And Fiona, you get the last word, and then I'll have 1 minute to wrap up.
Okay, I will be extremely brief. I will just add, I think, to my fellow panelists two sort of broader brush pros and cons of ceasing or reducing military assistance to Ukraine. I think on the cons, there would be damage to NATO credibility, rightly or wrongly, to stand by smaller countries and indeed their allies in the event that they're attacked by bigger countries. And that may be a lesson that's drawn by either US allies, or it is a lesson that's drawn by US adversaries, that the NATO countries simply don't have the thick skin to tolerate the costs in the long run of defending these smaller countries, so you can outweigh them. On the pro side of things, to be sort of fair to the question, I think 2 points that I would note are just a question of strategic priorities, that there are finite munitions and material that Europe and the United States have to provide in Ukraine's case, and that will need to increase, I understand, if assistance is going to continue in the very long term. And secondly is the escalation risk issue, that as long as there is NATO assistance, it could touch on something that turns out to be much more sensitive or important than to Russia than is understood by Ukraine, or there's an accident. So as long as NATO assistance continues, there is, I think, this tiniest speck of escalation risk that will continue to hold over the conflict and affect the prospects for nuclear risk.
Thank you very much. Listen, we are at the end of our time. I want to thank our speakers so much for an incredibly rich and engaging conversation. I know I've learned a lot. I hope our audience has as well. So thank you so much for your attention, cooperation, and insights. I want to thank Professor Katzenstein for kind introductions of all of us, and also thank Cornell and the REPI Institute for hosting. And with that, I think we've thanked everyone I need to thank, and we are done. So, and again, we hope this conflict in Ukraine will end. We don't see much hope of that in the current time, and so there'll be lots to keep talking about. But in the meantime, thank you so much. Over and out, and have a wonderful rest of your day.